She thought it was just a harmless joke. On live television, Karoline Leavitt laughed at Jasmine Crockett's middle name, Oluwasi, calling it a Wi-Fi password. The audience chuckled until they saw the face of a young black girl in the second row, stone still, hands clenched, eyes wide. That's when everyone realized this wasn't about pronunciation. It was about dignity. What Jasmine said next didn't come with anger, but with a story so personal, so powerful, the room went silent. And by the time she finished, no one was laughing, not even Karoline. If you've ever been asked to shrink who you are just to fit in, hit like, drop your name in the comments, and subscribe, because this is one story you'll never forget. The studio wasn't packed, but it was full enough to feel real. Pale wood floors, warm overhead lights, a stage dressed not for drama, but for conversation. The host welcomed the audience like he always did, smooth, practiced, a little sentimental. Tonight, he said, we talk about names, not just what we call each other, but what we carry when we do. Karoline Leavitt was the first guest out. Ivory blazer, pearl earrings, heels that echoed against the floor with quiet confidence. She smiled like a woman who'd sat in enough green rooms to know how to own her space without ever looking like she was trying to. She greeted the host, took her seat, crossed her legs. Everything about her posture said, relaxed, relatable, in control. Then came Jasmine Crockett. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't pause for applause. She walked out in black, soft fabric, no shine, no extra. And she moved like someone who wasn't there to be watched, but to watch. Her handshake with the host was brief. Her glance toward Karoline was even shorter. The topic was simple enough: identity in public spaces. What do we keep and what do we let go of to fit in? The questions were mild at first. Do names matter? Do appearances influence policy? Are Americans too sensitive about cultural differences? Karoline answered first. I think everyone should be proud of where they come from, she said. But when we enter a shared space, schools, workplaces, government, we also have to meet in the middle. That might mean spelling things phonetically, shortening names, making adjustments so that we can all connect more easily. She smiled. It wasn't cruel, not even smug. It was the kind of smile people wear when they think they're being helpful, and maybe she thought she was. Then the host turned to Jasmine. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, do you believe names need to be changed or shortened to be understood? Jasmine looked at him, not with confrontation, but with stillness. She waited. She tilted her head slightly, and then she asked, not the host, but the audience, have you ever seen a name get laughed at before anyone even tried to learn what it meant? There was a beat, just one, but it was the kind of pause that says, something's coming. Then Karoline leaned in, almost casually, and said, Oluwasi? Honestly, it sounds like someone forgot to finish typing their Wi-Fi password. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel, but it landed. Loudly. Soft chuckles scattered through the audience. A few shrugged. One man clapped twice. The host blinked but didn't interrupt. And in the second row, something changed. There was a girl, brown-skinned, maybe 11 or 12, braids tucked neatly. A soft pink sweater and her hands folded in her lap. She had smiled when Jasmine walked out. Not a big smile, just enough to say, that one looks like me. But now she wasn't smiling. Her lips pressed together, her eyes wide, her fingers clenched. Jasmine didn't laugh. She didn't raise her eyebrow or cock her head in indignation. She just turned and looked, not at Karoline, but at the girl. And that single movement told everyone in the room, this wasn't going to be funny anymore. Karoline was still smiling. She didn't sense the shift yet. I'm just saying, she went on, if we want to talk about inclusion, maybe we should also talk about making things easier for everyone else too. A name like that on a resume? People might skip it just because they can't pronounce it. The audience didn't laugh this time. They didn't frown either. They just sat a little stiffer, because it had gone from a quip to a statement, from a joke to a judgment. The host looked down at his cue cards. Then, sensing the mood had changed, he looked up. Congresswoman Crockett, he said softly, almost cautiously. What would you like to say to that? Jasmine adjusted her posture, slowly, intentionally. And then she looked out over the audience and said, "I used to ask my mom not to write my middle name on school forms. I told her it was embarrassing, that no one could say it, that teachers would stumble over it and kids would laugh. I wanted to be Jessica, or Jenny, or something that fit on the line." She paused. "And my mother," she continued, "never yelled at me. She didn't say I was being ungrateful. She just sat next to me one night and said, 'You can change anything in your life, your clothes, your job, your path, but never forget who first said your name out loud.'" The girl in the second row shifted. Her hands unclenched, ever so slightly. Jasmine glanced at Karoline, then back at the audience. "We ask people to shorten their names to be accessible, but accessible to who? Who is doing the shortening? And who gets to stay whole while the rest of us are expected to trim ourselves down?" Karoline opened her mouth to respond, but the host gently placed a hand on the desk. "Not yet." And Jasmine looked directly into the camera. "My middle name is Oluwasi. It means God has done this. And my grandmother gave it to my mother, who gave it to me, so I would never forget that I come from a line of women who survived, prayed, worked, and sacrificed in languages no one ever cared to learn." The chuckles stopped. The jokes fell away. And somewhere in that room, dozens of people quietly realized they had heard a name, but they hadn't listened. Jasmine sat back, not with pride, not with performance, but with peace, because she had just reclaimed what no one had a right to mock. And in the second row, a young girl blinked slowly, her fingers open now on her lap, resting, not clenched, seen. It would take hours for the clip to spread online. It would take days for people to repeat her words. But it only took one moment for the room to realize they had been laughing at something they never even tried to understand, and they weren't laughing anymore. The clip hit the internet within the hour. It wasn't promoted. It didn't have fancy graphics or a branded caption. Just the raw footage of Jasmine Crockett's voice, measured, deliberate, and that one line, "Never forget who first said your name out loud." By sunrise, the video had already passed 1 million views. Teachers were sharing it. Elders were replaying it. Grandparents who rarely touched YouTube called their grandchildren to say, "Did you see the woman on TV who talked about her name? That could have been me." In Atlanta, a retired pastor forwarded the video to his church board with just one sentence: "This is why we didn't change our names when we marched." In Los Angeles, a group of high school students passed the clip around on AirDrop and sat in silence together, watching it twice. One girl whispered, "My mom made me use Emily on job applications. I never knew it made me feel so blank. Be out." And in a quiet home in Cleveland, the young girl who had sat in the second row with clenched fists watched herself on screen. She didn't flinch this time. She just stared at the moment Jasmine turned toward her and saw her. Jasmine hadn't known the impact she'd make. She left the studio quietly that night, taking no questions from press, offering no post-show interviews. Her staff didn't prep a statement. They didn't need to. The story had already walked out into the world on its own 2 feet. Karoline, on the other hand, didn't expect the silence. No backlash, no protest. Just stillness. An emptiness in her inbox where the applause used to be. No congratulatory texts. No retweets from allies. And perhaps that was worse, because she hadn't meant harm. But intent doesn't cancel impact. And people were no longer looking to her for what came next. The next morning, the host released a statement on his personal blog. He didn't name names. He didn't offer apologies. He just wrote, "Sometimes the best part of a conversation isn't the answer. It's the pause that finally makes people think." In a church in Mississippi, a woman stood during testimony and said, "My name is Imani. For years, I went by Mona to make it easier for customers at the diner, but Imani means faith. And from now on, I want y'all to use it, because that name was prayed over me before I was even born." Boo. In a high school civics class in Boston, the teacher paused her lesson and played the clip. She didn't explain. She didn't assign homework. She just handed out blank note cards and said, "Write your full name. Then, if you can, write what it means. And if you don't know, write who gave it to you." One boy who rarely spoke wrote, "My grandfather named me after the man who saved his life during the war. I never asked who that was. I will tonight." Back in Washington, Jasmine sat in her office sorting mail. Among the folders and budget briefings was a single envelope, no return address. Inside was a torn piece of lined paper, written in blue pen. You said what I never knew I needed to hear. My daughter used to cry when her teacher got her name wrong. I told her to get used to it. I won't say that again. No name, no signature. But it didn't need one. Meanwhile, Karoline stayed quiet. Her advisor suggested she go back on the same show and explain. But she declined. Not out of pride, not out of guilt. She just knew, somewhere deep inside, that anything she said would be heard as noise. The moment wasn't hers anymore, and maybe it never was. The conversation had changed, not in volume, but in direction. In Denver, a librarian organized a name day for the kids in her after-school program. Every child had to say their full name and what it meant to their family. One girl named Zahara said, "My name means flower that blooms in the desert. My grandma said I was born during her hardest year. She named me so I wouldn't forget I could survive anything." One by one, small stories began unfolding across the country. Not headlines, not protests, not debates. Just a mother in Chicago reprinting her daughter's birth certificate to include her full middle name. Just a college student in Ohio emailing her professor, "Please stop calling me V. My name is Vidatri. It means creator of the universe, and it matters." Just a father in Arizona who had never cried in front of his son until they watched Jasmine's clip together. And when his son asked, "Why are you crying?" he whispered, "Because I used to want to be called Kevin." The shift didn't come through politics. It came through memory. And the laughter had long stopped, because the country wasn't laughing anymore. It was remembering. 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened. A well-respected university in Philadelphia announced a symposium titled Legacy and the Spoken Name. On the list of featured speakers were poets, linguists, pastors, and to the surprise of nearly everyone, both Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt. There was no flashy press run, no trailers or hype, but word spread fast. Older Americans, especially those with roots in church, migration, or activism, took special notice. Many had spent their entire lives navigating spaces where their names had been misread, misunderstood, or deliberately shortened. They didn't want a fight. They wanted to know if Karoline had learned something, if Jasmine would still speak with that same quiet fire, if anyone would say the names they had stopped saying aloud decades ago. When the evening arrived, the auditorium filled quickly. Among the crowd were civil rights veterans in pressed suits, children holding handwritten signs with their full names, and elderly women clutching church fans with names printed on the back: Bertha, Glory, Amarachi. The moderator introduced the evening with a simple prompt. Tonight isn't about correction. It's about confession. We carry names like we carry history. Let's listen for both. Karoline spoke first. Her voice was steady, not defensive, not rehearsed. 3 weeks ago, I made a joke on live television, she began, and I didn't realize until much later that what I thought was harmless was actually a cut someone else had been asked to laugh off 1,000 times before. I thought I was being relatable, but what I was really doing was removing a piece of someone else's story without their permission. She paused, not for applause, for air. I didn't come tonight to apologize into a microphone. I came to listen to the weight of what I missed. Some nodded. Others just looked down at the paper programs in their laps, rereading Jasmine's name. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod. When it was her turn, she stood slowly and walked to the edge of the stage. She didn't take the podium. "I'm not going to talk about my name tonight," she said. "You already know what it means, but I want to talk about yours, about the name your grandmother used to call you when you were sick, the name your uncle gave you that you erased from your email signature, the name they mispronounced at graduation, and the one you never corrected." The room went still. Jasmine continued. "See, I thought I was alone in that. Thought it was just me and my mother's stubbornness. But it wasn't. It was you too. I didn't go on that show to change anyone's mind. I went to honor the woman who refused to shrink her name so her daughter wouldn't have to. And somehow, you all heard your mothers in that too." A woman in the third row sniffled. She folded her hands tightly and whispered to the person beside her. "My daddy called me Chiamaka until the 3rd grade. Then I asked him to stop. Said it was too hard for my teacher. He never said it again. "Okay." And at that moment, Karoline looked at Jasmine. This time, it wasn't about being right. It wasn't even about being forgiven. It was about learning. When the panel ended, they didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. But they stood side by side and answered audience questions for over an hour. Elderly men stood to ask, "How do we teach our grandkids that the name we gave them matters?" Middle schoolers asked, "How do I correct someone without sounding rude?" One woman simply asked, "How do you stop feeling ashamed for saying your own name the way your mother said it?" Jasmine's answer was soft. "You don't need to be loud. Just be sure. The shame doesn't belong to you." And Karoline added, "And if someone laughs, let it fall on them, not on your shoulders." By the end of the night, the university bookstore had sold out of journals. People wanted to write things down, not headlines, not hashtags, just names. That same week, a church in Baltimore hosted a name revival. Instead of worship songs, elders stood and spoke the full names of family members no longer alive, names that had been softened, abbreviated, forgotten. One man wept as he said, "Her name was Abina. I called her Abby for 40 years. I wish I hadn't." At a senior center in Houston, a woman named Soledad led a name circle. She spoke hers with pride. Soledad means solitude, but it also means strength when no one's watching. And in a quiet assisted living facility in Iowa, a nurse asked a resident if there was a name she hadn't used in a while. The woman smiled faintly and said, "Only one. My mother called me Zuleika. No one else ever has." The next morning, her name was printed in full above her bed. Sometimes, revolution doesn't look like marching. Sometimes, it looks like a name spelled out completely on a sticky note and placed where someone can finally see it. And from that moment on, no one ever called her Z again. In the weeks after the symposium, something strange and beautiful happened. Not online, but offline. The story didn't trend, it took root. In a barbershop in Montgomery, Alabama, an older man named Elijah told a teenager sweeping the floor, "My real name is not Eli. It's Eliezer. My mama gave it to me because it means God is my help. But in the army, they said it was too long. Called me Eli. It just stuck. But I always felt like I'd left something behind." The teenager looked up, surprised. He thought the man's name had always been Eli. He wrote it on his contacts list differently that day. In Brooklyn, New York, a group of Black and Puerto Rican women gathered in a community hall for their regular Saturday crochet circle. That day, they didn't pick up their needles. They pulled out pens. One by one, they wrote down the full names their mothers and grandmothers had whispered into their ears at birth, the names they'd abandoned for something easier, smoother, less questioned. They passed the list around. Some names had 5 syllables, some had accents or meanings, some were never spoken outside the home again. Until now. At a veterans' home in Louisiana, an event was held called the Roll Call. Each resident was invited to say their full name, who gave it to them, and what it meant, if they knew. One man said, "My name was once Yitzchak. Everyone called me Jack since the war. But when I close my eyes at night, I still hear my grandmother say, 'Yitzchak, come help me with the bread.'" No one laughed, not one person. In a tribal council center in South Dakota, elders asked school children to bring in name meanings from home. One Lakota boy wrote on a folded sheet, "They call me Josh. My real name is Chaska. It means firstborn son. I want my teacher to say it like my grandfather used to." The ripple didn't come from shouting. It came from remembering. It wasn't dramatic. It was intimate. Like remembering a song you forgot you loved. Like hearing your full name said aloud in a room of strangers and realizing it still belongs to you. At a small AME church in rural Virginia, an 83-year-old woman stood during prayer requests and said, "I'd like to ask the Lord to bless me by my full name this morning. My mother named me Ernestina. I've gone by Tina for 70 years, but I want to go to heaven with the name she gave me." The pastor didn't flinch. He nodded, and that morning he prayed over her by every syllable. In a retirement home in Arizona, a Filipino nurse asked a resident gently, "Do you want me to call you Mary like everyone else, or do you want to be called by your real name?" The woman looked up slowly, tears catching in her lashes, and whispered, "My name is Marisol. I'd like to hear it again before I forget it. Even in places where the story never aired, where the internet didn't reach or interest had waned, people still felt it. As if the honesty of Jasmine's words had lingered like smoke in a room that no one had aired out in years. The movement didn't wear signs or wave banners. It arrived in quiet requests, in teachers asking for pronunciation, in parents reprinting birth certificates, in old friends calling each other by names they hadn't heard in decades. One elementary teacher in Iowa taped a sign above her desk. Every letter matters. Every name is a story. Don't abbreviate someone else's soul. At a community center in Detroit, an intergenerational writing workshop gave out a new prompt. Write the name your mother called you when no one else was around. Some participants cried, others wrote in silence. One woman turned in a slip that read only, "My name was Lulame. I haven't heard it in 50 years. Thank you for giving me a reason to write it again." By Thanksgiving, dozens of families across the country set an extra plate. Not for the dead, not for tradition, but for names. Names no one said aloud at work. Names hidden in driver's licenses. Names that had been too heavy to carry until Jasmine helped them lift. One family in Minneapolis made place cards using ancestral names. A man in Florida corrected his in-laws when they shortened his daughter's name. A teenager in California added her full middle name to her social media profile, not to stand out, but to finally feel whole. Karoline didn't appear in public much that fall, but a quiet photo surfaced weeks later, her attending a small book club gathering in New Hampshire. No press, no statement, just a handwritten name tag clipped to her blouse. And it read, in careful marker, Karoline Marie Leavitt, and my great-grandmother was Oluwatunmise. She never said it on stage, she didn't post it online, but someone had asked her during a conversation, "Did your family ever change their names?" She had answered simply, "Yes, and I'm starting to wonder what we lost when we did." In a quiet corner of Washington, Jasmine Crockett sat on her porch reading letters. She kept a box labeled Unspoken. Inside were notes from strangers, elders, children, teachers, parents, people who said they found a part of themselves in her silence that night. She didn't reply to all of them, but every so often, she'd write one line back, "Say it how your mother did. That's enough." Winter came quietly that year. Snow settled over neighborhoods like pages, waiting for words. But inside homes across the country, something had already been written, and it wasn't legislation or campaign promises. It was names, spoken, remembered, said without apology. In Tulsa, a 76-year-old man visited the county clerk's office with a single request. He wanted his middle name restored to the full Yoruba spelling on his state ID. The clerk asked why now, after all these years. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "Because I don't want to die without being called what my mother named me. Not once, not even once." In Sacramento, a woman gave birth to her first child. She named her daughter Nasira, after her grandmother. When the nurse asked if she'd like to include a more modern name for ease, she smiled and whispered, "She'll learn to spell her name before anyone else learns to shorten it." Jasmine Crockett never stepped back into the spotlight. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't need to. The message had left her mouth and made a home in other people's hearts. Her office still received letters, hundreds. Some were one line. "My name is Guadalupe, and I'm not going by Lupe anymore." Others were full pages of grief, of pride, of stories never told aloud. One came from a veteran who had spent 42 years going by a name the military gave him. It ended with the line, "I just want my grandchildren to know who I really was." At a small-town meeting in Iowa, someone proposed a new policy for the local school district, required teachers to learn the pronunciation of each student's name by the second week of class. The motion passed unanimously. The room applauded, not out of politics, but out of love. Meanwhile, Karoline sat at her kitchen table one night, flipping through an old photo album. On the back of one image, a woman in white gloves standing on a dirt road, was a name she hadn't seen since childhood. She traced the letters with her finger, Oluwatunmise. She whispered it aloud, just once, but once was enough. She didn't go on an apology tour. She didn't stage a comeback, but in her own way, she made space. At a literacy event in Concord, she sat beside a young girl reading her full name during introductions. The girl hesitated at first, then read it, all of it. Karoline leaned over and said quietly, "Thank you for keeping it whole." A teacher nearby overheard. That night, she wrote it on a sticky note and taped it to her desk. It read, "Keep it whole." Church bulletins across the South started printing full baptism names in their Sunday programs. Nursing homes updated their welcome boards to include middle names and name origins. Family reunions added name circles to their weekend agendas, where elders explained the stories behind each name on the family tree. In Chicago, a group of Somali mothers began meeting weekly, not for childcare support, but to practice saying their children's names in full, aloud, without fear of being misunderstood. And in a community theater in Vermont, a play debuted called Her Real Name Was. It was based entirely on letters sent to Jasmine Crockett's office. Every performance ended the same way. The cast stood silently and said one name each. Names that had once been cut short, misread, erased. And then they left the stage, leaving only the names hanging in the air. Jasmine sat in the back row opening night. No one announced her. No spotlight found her. But when the final name was spoken, she closed her eyes and smiled. Somewhere near the end of that winter, a little girl stood up in a classroom for show and tell. She said, "My name is Mirembe. It means peace. And today I brought in a photo of my great-grandma who gave me that name. I used to say my name was Mimi because it was easier, but now I want people to learn it right, because that's how she said it." The teacher wrote the name on the board in big letters, Mirembe, and beside it she added, "Say it the way she deserves." That phrase began appearing in places no one expected, above coffee shop registers, inside church bulletins, on classroom walls, in handwritten letters pinned to corkboards in senior centers. Not a slogan, not a movement, just a memory made visible. And when spring came, it brought no headlines. But it brought something better. It brought people calling each other by the names they were meant to be called, the names that had stayed. If this story touched your heart, let your voice be heard. Share your name in the comments and tell us what it means to you. And if you believe in stories that honor identity and truth, like subscribe and stay with us, we'll keep telling the ones that matter.